parish records of East Baton Rouge contain an anomaly that Louisiana historians have deliberately avoided for over 170 years. In March of 1845, 17 plantation ledgers were simultaneously altered, each one documenting the sale of a single enslaved man whose physical description violated every social convention of the antebellum South. What made authorities across 3 parishes destroy their correspondence about this individual? Why did 7 prominent families abandon their ancestral homes within 18 months of his arrival? The answer lies buried in private diaries that were sealed by court order until 1945, and what those pages reveal about desire, power, and the carefully constructed lies of Southern society will force you to question everything you thought you knew about that brutal era. Before we continue with the story of what happened when beauty became a weapon in the most unlikely hands, I need you to do something for me. Hit that subscribe button right now, because this channel brings you the darkest secrets America tried to forget. And drop a comment telling me what state or city you're listening from. I want to know where my fellow mystery lovers are hiding. Now, let's talk about a truth so dangerous that it nearly unraveled the entire social fabric of Louisiana's capital region. The events that would shake Baton Rouge to its foundation began not in Louisiana, but in the suffocating humidity of a Charleston auction house, where human beings were displayed like livestock, and where one man's appearance would prove more devastating than any rebellion. Charleston in 1844 existed as the beating heart of the domestic slave trade, a city where fortunes were built on the systematic cataloging and sale of human flesh. The Ryan's Mart auction house stood at the corner of Chalmers and State Streets, a 3-story building with iron beck windows that had processed over 40,000 souls through its doors since 1818. The auction block itself was worn smooth by decades of bare feet, the wood stained dark by sweat and tears, and the residue of human suffering that no amount of scrubbing could remove. It was here on a September morning, when the heat pressed down like a physical weight, that a peculiar transaction took place. The auctioneer, a man named Horace Benamon, who prided himself on 26 years of experience in evaluating human merchandise, found himself struggling with an assessment that defied his professional expertise. The enslaved man on the block was listed in the ledger as Jules, aged approximately 23, property of the deceased Edgar Fontaine estate of Beaufort. Standard notation would typically include marks, scars, skills, temperament, but Venom's entry contained something unprecedented, a full paragraph describing physical characteristics, followed by a notation that read, "Buyer discretion strongly advised. Household placement only. Fieldwork inadvisable due to attention factor." What made Jules remarkable was immediately apparent to anyone who looked at him. His features possessed a symmetry that seemed almost mathematical in its precision. High cheekbones that caught the light, eyes of unusual clarity set beneath a strong brow, a jawline that sculptors might spend years attempting to capture in marble. His skin was smooth and unblemished, his physique suggesting strength without brutishness. But it was something beyond mere physical attributes that made seasoned traders uncomfortable. There was an intelligence in his gaze, a quiet dignity in his bearing that seemed to mock the chains he wore. The Fontaine estate had kept Jules isolated for most of his life, employing him primarily as a house servant, carefully controlling his interactions. Estate documents would later reveal that Edgar Fontaine had recognized early the problematic nature of Jules's appearance, and had implemented strict protocols to minimize complications. But Fontaine's death had forced the liquidation of assets, and Jules had entered the general market for the first time in his life. The bidding that morning was unlike anything Venom had witnessed. Several prominent planters bid aggressively, then abruptly withdrew. 2 buyers got into a physical altercation over bidding protocol. A woman in the observer's gallery fainted and had to be carried out. The final price, $1,200, was nearly 3 times the average for a prime field hand purchased by an agent representing an anonymous buyer from Louisiana. That buyer was Mateus Devo, patriarch of the Devo plantation, one of the most profitable sugar estates in the Baton Rouge district. Devo was 53 years old, a widower who had built his fortune through calculated ruthlessness and an absolute understanding of the social mechanisms that sustained his world. He had 4 children from his late wife, 2 sons, Nathaniel and Marcus, aged 24 and 21 respectively, and 2 daughters, Catherine and Elise, aged 19 and 16. The Devereux plantation encompassed 3,000 acres of prime Mississippi River bottomland worked by 218 enslaved people. The main house was a Greek Revival masterpiece with 16 rooms, 6 massive columns across the front gallery, and gardens that had been featured in Southern Cultivator magazine. Everything about the estate projected order, prosperity, and unshakable control. Matthias Deer had purchased Jules' site unseen based solely on the Charleston agent's description and a single gerotype. What motivated this decision would become a subject of intense speculation. But surviving correspondence suggests DeVoe believed he understood exactly what he was acquiring and how to manage it. He was a man who had controlled every variable in his life for 3 decades. He had no reason to believe this acquisition would be any different. Well arrived at the DeVoe plantation in early October 1844, transported by steamboat and then by wagon along the river road. The journey had taken 11 days. He spoke rarely, ate little, and maintained a neutral expression that revealed nothing of his thoughts. The overseer who accompanied him noted in his report that Jules was unnaturally composed, shows no signs of resistance or emotion, condition excellent, potential value high if managed correctly. Matthias Deo's initial plan was straightforward. Jules would serve as a personal valet, a position that would keep him primarily within the main house and away from the general slave population. This isolation was essential. Deru understood that beauty of any kind represented the disruption to the rigid hierarchies that made plantation life function. A beautiful enslaved woman was a well-known complication. A beautiful enslaved man was something the social order had no established protocols to manage. For the first 3 months, the arrangement seemed to work. Jules performed his duties with mechanical efficiency, managing Matthias's wardrobe, preparing his shaving kit each morning, attending him during business meetings. He was essentially invisible, present, but somehow absent, fulfilling his role without creating friction. But invisibility, it turned out, was impossible. The first signs of trouble came from within the Deer family itself. Catherine, the 19-year-old daughter, began requesting Jules's assistance with increasingly trivial tasks, adjusting curtains in rooms he had no business entering, retrieving books from the library when house slaves were readily available, carrying messages that could have been delivered by any servant. Her younger sister, Elise, started appearing in rooms she knew Jules was working in, finding excuses to linger. Nathaniel, the eldest son, responded differently. He began making comments at dinner about the necessity of keeping house slaves in their proper place, suggesting that certain individuals should be reassigned to field work. His brother Marcus, quieter by nature, said little, but watched Jules with an expression that mixed fascination and barely concealed resentment. But the most concerning reaction came from someone entirely outside the Deru household. Vivian Dezon was the 28-year-old wife of Laurent Dezon, owner of the adjacent Oak Grove plantation. The Desamp estate was smaller than the Devoe holdings, but equally profitable, and the two families maintained the elaborate social dance of neighboring planters, formal dinners, joint hunting parties, carefully calibrated visiting protocols. Vivienne was considered one of the most beautiful women in the parish, a former New Orleans society figure whose marriage to Lauren had been the event of the 1839 social season. She first saw Jules in December 1844 during a Christmas week dinner at the Deer House. He was serving wine, moving through the dining room with the expected difference. Their eyes met for perhaps 2 seconds. Bevan's hand trembled, spilling wine onto the white tablecloth. The stain spread slowly, dark as blood against the linen. From that moment, something irrevocable began. Bevan started visiting the Dio plantation with unusual frequency, always with some reasonable excuse, discussing garden designs with Catherine, consulting with Matthias about business matters that concerned both estates, borrowing books from the Deru library. But servants noticed that her visits coincided with times when Jules was visible, that her eyes tracked him as he moved through rooms, that she found ways to ensure their paths crossed. Laurent Desson noticed too. He was not a stupid man, and he understood the dangerous territory his wife was entering. In January 1845, he had a private meeting with Matthias Deru. No record of their conversation exists, but witnesses reported that Laurent left the meeting with a rigid expression, his jaw clenched so tight that a vein throbbed visibly at his temple. 1 week later, Matthias reassigned Jules from house service to working in the plantation's carpentry shop, a substantial building located 200 YD from the main house. It was a strategic move, keeping Jules on the property but reducing his visibility particularly to female members of the household and visiting society women. The carpentry shop was run by an enslaved man named Abraham, a skilled craftsman who had been building furniture and maintaining plantation structures for 15 years. Abraham was in his late 40s, a pragmatic survivor who understood the unspoken rules that kept him alive and relatively secure in his position. He took one look at Jules and immediately recognized the problem. "You're going to get people killed," Abraham said on Jules's first day in the shop. "You understand that, don't you? Just by existing, you're a loaded gun." Jules said nothing. He had learned long ago that silence was its own form of protection. Abraham sighed and handed Jules a plane for smoothing wood. "Keep your head down. Don't make eye contact with anyone you don't have to. And for God's sake, stay away from the main house when there are visitors." But staying invisible was becoming impossible because the problem was metastasizing beyond individual attraction into something that threatened the entire social structure. The first week of February 1845 brought a cold snap unusual for Louisiana. Temperatures dropping into the 20s at night, frost forming delicate patterns on windows throughout the parish. The cold made everyone irritable. Disrupted routines forced people into closer indoor quarters than the usual sprawling distances of plantation life. On February 9th, Matthias Stier hosted a business dinner for 5 neighboring planters and their wives. The purpose was to discuss collective action regarding recent abolitionist literature that had been circulating through New Orleans, material that was inflaming fears of slave rebellion and northern interference. These meetings had become common, Southern planters coordinating their response to what they perceived as existential threats to their way of life. Jules was not supposed to be anywhere near this gathering, but the regular house staff was short-handed due to illness, and Matthias made the decision to bring Jules in temporarily to assist with serving. It was a calculated risk based on necessity, and it would prove to be a catastrophic error in judgment. The guests arrived at 6 timed, along with Lauren and Riefen de Samp. The party included Charles and Eugenia Broussard, owners of Magnolia Grove Plantation, Robert and Sarah Beaumont from Oakwood Estate, Thomas Hartwell, a widower from Bellefonte Plantation, and Dr. Twentier, Marcus Clayton, and his wife Helen, who owned a smaller property called Cedar Hill. The evening began with the usual protocols: bourbon and conversation in the parlor, discussions of sugar prices and river commerce, carefully modulated small talk that revealed nothing while assessing everything. Jules moved through these spaces like a shadow, refilling glasses, removing empty plates, maintaining the invisible presence that good service required. But something was different. The women were watching him, not just Vivian Desamps, though her gaze was the most intense, but Eugenia Broussard and Sarah Beaumont as well. Helen Clayton, the doctor's wife, kept her eyes deliberately averted, but her rigid posture and flushed cheeks revealed her awareness. The men noticed this attention, and the atmosphere in the room began to curdle. Dinner was served at 8. Jules stood along the wall with another house slave named Thomas, ready to respond to requests. The conversation turned to business, strategies for countering abolitionist propaganda, discussion of recent legislation, debate about whether Louisiana should strengthen its laws governing the education of enslaved people. Laurent Desson was drinking heavily, his consumption outpacing the other men. His eyes kept moving between his wife and Jules, calculating angles, measuring distances. Vivian was seated directly across from her husband, and she was barely eating, pushing food around her plate while maintaining a fixed smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I've been meaning to mention," Lauren said suddenly, interrupting a discussion about cotton futures, "that I think we should consider implementing stricter protocols about which slaves are allowed in mixed company house service privileges. I mean, some individuals present complications that outweigh their usefulness." The table went quiet. Everyone understood he was talking about Jules, who stood motionless against the wall, his face revealing nothing. Matthias Deo carefully set down his fork. "Are you suggesting I don't know how to manage my own property, Lauren? I'm suggesting that certain types of property present unique challenges that require unique solutions. You know exactly what I'm talking about. I know you've had too much bourbon and you're being discourteous in my home." Bevan's face went pale. She reached across the table as if to touch her husband's arm, then thought better of it. "Laurent, please." "Please what?" Laurent's voice was rising. "Please pretend we're not all thinking the same thing. Please act like it's normal to have that." He gestured toward Jules without looking at him, parading around where decent women have to look at him. Charles Broussard cleared his throat. "Perhaps we should retire to the parlor for cigars. Let the ladies have their coffee in peace." But Lauren wasn't finished. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "You want to know what the real threat to our way of life is? It's not abolitionists in Boston. It's not slave rebellions. It's this." He pointed directly at Jules. "It's pretending that we can maintain order when we allow disruptions to the natural hierarchy. That creature should be in the fields where he belongs, not serving dinner to our wives. Sit down, Lauren." Matthias's voice was cold and quiet. "Now or what? You'll defend your pet's honor. We all know why you bought him. We've all heard the stories from Charleston. You thought you could control this, but you can't. Look at what's already happening." Thomas Hartwell, the widower, stood up. "Gentlemen, this is inappropriate dinner conversation. Whatever disagreements exist should be handled privately," but the damage was done. The evening was irreparably fractured. The dinner party broke up shortly after, guests leaving early with strained goodbyes and promises to continue discussions another time. Vivian Desamp looked back once as she was leaving, her eyes finding Jules in the shadowed hallway. Her expression was impossible to read. Desperation, longing, guilt, fury, all mixed together. Lauren saw that look. Everyone saw it. The next morning, G was removed from all house duties permanently. Matthias assigned him full-time to the carpentry shop with explicit instructions that he was not to enter the main house under any circumstances. Abraham L. Clerk was given personal responsibility for supervising Jules's movements and ensuring he had no contact with anyone beyond the immediate work crew. "You see what you've done?" Abraham said not unkindly. "You didn't do anything, and that's exactly the problem. Your face is doing all the damage." Jules finally spoke. His voice was quiet, educated in a way that suggested careful training. "I know what I am. I've always known there's no solution to it." "Well, we better find one because this is just beginning." Abraham was right. Within 2 weeks, 3 things happened that demonstrated how rapidly the situation was deteriorating. First, Catherine Devo, who had been promised in an informal engagement to the son of a prominent Natchez family, abruptly broke off the arrangement. No explanation was offered, but her father's fury shook the household. She had thrown away a socially advantageous match for no apparent reason, and Matthias knew, though he couldn't prove that it had something to do with Jules. Second, a slave named David from the Oak Grove plantation, Laurent Dason's estate, was found beaten nearly to death in the quarters. When he finally regained consciousness, he told a story about being caught carrying a note. He destroyed the note rather than reveal its contents, but witnesses reported that he had been seen near the Dio property line earlier that day. The implication was clear. Someone at Oak Grove was attempting to communicate with someone at Dio Plantation, and Laurent Desamp had responded with characteristic brutality. Third, and most ominously, Vivienne Desamp stopped appearing at social functions. For 2 weeks, she was simply absent from the carefully choreographed social life of the planter class. Her husband offered vague explanations about her health, but servants from Oak Grove brought stories to their counterparts at other plantations. Bevan was confined to her room, watched constantly, her correspondence monitored, her movements restricted. She was effectively a prisoner in her own home. This was the context when something unprecedented happened. Something that would transform a private scandal into a public crisis and force every planter in the parish to confront questions they had spent their entire lives avoiding. On the morning of March 3rd, 1845, a Monday that dawned bright and cold, Abraham arrived at the carpentry shop to find Jules already there, sitting on the floor with his back against the workbench. His eyes were open, but he seemed to be staring at nothing. "You didn't sleep," Abraham said. It wasn't a question. "I dreamed about Charleston," Jules said, "about the auction block, about all the eyes looking at me like I was a horse they were considering purchasing. I woke up and realized nothing's changed. Different eyes, same transaction. I'm still merchandise. The only question is what kind of merchandise and what I'm worth to different buyers." Abraham sat down beside him, his old joints creaking. "You're educated." "How'd that happen?" "The Fontaine family in Baton. They had theories about improving slave value through selective education. They taught me to read, to write, to speak properly. They taught me French because they thought it made me more valuable as house property. They never considered that education might make me think, or that thinking might make everything worse. Makes you dangerous." Abraham said, "Man who looks like you and thinks like you, that's a combination this world isn't built to handle. I never asked for this face. Nobody asks for anything. We just get what we get and try to survive it." They sat in silence for a while, listening to birds in the trees outside, the distant sounds of plantation life starting its daily rhythm. Then Abraham said something that would later seem prophetic. "You know what's going to happen, don't you? Somebody's going to do something stupid. Not you. You too smart for that. But somebody who wants you, or somebody who's scared of you, or somebody who thinks you represent something that needs to be destroyed. And when they do, it's going to be bad for everyone." Jules looked at him. "Then what do I do?" "Stay invisible. It's the only protection you've got." But invisibility was no longer possible because Vivienne Desamp had made a decision that would shatter the carefully maintained facade of order that held plantation society together. On the afternoon of March the 7th, while Lauren was in New Orleans on business, Vivienne left Oak Grove Plantation. She didn't take a carriage or inform her household staff. She simply walked out of her home across the fields that separated Oak Grove from Debo property through a section of woods that ran along the property line, and directly to the carpentry shop where Jules worked. She arrived just before sunset. Abraham was the only other person present finishing an inventory of materials. He looked up to see Vivienne Desamp standing in the doorway, her dress muddy from the walk, her hair coming loose from its pins, her eyes fixed on Jules with an expression that made Abraham's blood run cold. "I need to speak with him," she said. "Alone." "Ma'am, I can't allow that." Mr. Dio would have my hide and your husband would probably kill me. Please, you need to go back home. I'm not leaving. Jules stood slowly. Mrs. Deschamps, whatever you think, stop talking. Her voice was shaking. I have to say something. And if I don't say it now, I never will. I've spent 6 months trying to convince myself that what I'm feeling isn't real, that it's some temporary madness that will pass if I just avoid you. But it hasn't passed. It's gotten worse, and I realize that I have two choices. I can live the rest of my life in that house, married to a man I don't love, pretending everything is fine, slowly dying inside. Or I can admit the truth. The truth is going to get people killed, Abraham said quietly, including you. I don't care anymore. Jules's face was unreadable. You don't mean that. I do. I mean it completely. I've never meant anything more in my life. I am walking away from everything. My marriage, my social position, my family's reputation. And I need you to come with me tonight. Now we can reach New Orleans by morning if we take the river. From there, we can get to Mexico or California or anywhere they won't find us. The silence that followed was absolute. Abraham looked like he wanted to disappear into the walls. Jules stood perfectly still, and for the first time since arriving at the Rouge plantation, his carefully maintained composure cracked. You understand what you're asking is impossible. Nothing is impossible if you want it badly enough. I'm enslaved, Mrs. Diemp. The legal term is property. You can't run away with property. That's called theft. They would hunt us. They would find us. And they would kill me in ways you can't imagine. And your life would be over in every way that matters. Your family would disown you. Society would destroy you. And for what? For freedom. For choice. For something real instead of the performance we're all forced to give every day. Jules shook his head slowly. That's not freedom. That's a beautiful fantasy that ends in violence. I've seen what happens to enslaved men who are accused of inappropriate contact with white women. I've heard the stories. There are things worse than death, and Southern justice specializes in them. Then what do? Just pretend this isn't happening. That's exactly what we do. You go back to your husband. I stay here. We never speak again. It's the only way any of us survives this. Viven's face twisted with something between rage and despair. I can't do that. I can't go back to that life. You don't understand what it's like. I don't understand what it's like to be trapped. To have no control over your own body, your own future, your own basic humanity. Jules's voice was rising for the first time. I've been enslaved my entire life. You've been trapped by social conventions for a few years. It's not the same thing. And you pretending it is makes this whole conversation obscene. Abraham had backed toward the door, ready to run if necessary. The conversation had crossed into territory that could get them all killed. Viven was crying now, tears streaming down her face. I thought maybe. You thought wrong. Go home. Forget you came here. Forget we ever had this conversation. If anyone asks, tell them you went for a walk and got lost. Make up any story you need to, but do not come back here ever. She stood there for what felt like an eternity, her body shaking with silent sobs. Then she turned and walked out into the gathering darkness, disappearing into the trees without looking back. Abraham and Jules stood in the silent shop for a long moment. Finally, Abraham said, You know this isn't over. I know. She's going to tell someone, maybe not deliberately, but in some moment of weakness, it's going to come out. And when it does, I'll already be dead one way or another. But what neither of them understood was that the story had already begun to spread, carried by the one witness they hadn't accounted for, a slave woman named Ruth from the Oak Grove plantation, who had followed Viven at a distance, worried about her mistress's strange behavior. Ruth had seen Viven enter the carpentry shop. She had heard raised voices, though not distinct words, and when Viven emerged crying, Ruth had followed her back to Oak Grove and immediately reported what she'd witnessed to the head housewoman, who told the overseer, who told Laurent Desson the moment he returned from New Orleans. Within 24 hours, every plantation in the parish knew that Bibian Desson had gone alone to see Zoo. The story mutated as it spread. Some versions had them embracing. Others had Jules rejecting her violently. Still others invented elaborate conversations about running away together. None of the versions were accurate, but accuracy didn't matter. What mattered was that a white woman of high social standing had sought out an enslaved man in private, and the implications of that action were going to tear the community apart. Laurent Desamp's response was swift and public. On March 9th, he petitioned the parish court for a formal investigation into improper conduct on the Dio plantation, specifically naming Jules as a threat to public morality and order, The petition was extraordinary. A master essentially accusing another master of failing to properly control enslaved property, bringing private plantation business into the legal sphere where it could become public record. Matthias Dio countered with his own petition, accusing Lauron of slander and demanding the matter be handled through private arbitration. But the damage was done. The case was going to proceed, and it was going to force everyone involved to testify under oath about matters that proper society pretended didn't exist. The trial was scheduled for March 25th. In the intervening 2 weeks, the tensions that had been building for months began to explode in ways no one could have predicted. If you're feeling that same tension right now, that need to know what happened next, then do me a favor. Hit that like button, drop a comment with your theories about how this could possibly resolve itself, and make sure you're subscribed, because this story is about to take turns that will leave you questioning human nature itself. Now, let's talk about what happened when the trial began, and secrets that should have stayed buried forever started coming to light. The days leading up to the trial transformed the parish into a pressure cooker of gossip, fear, and barely suppressed violence. What had begun as a private scandal was becoming a public spectacle that threatened to expose the fundamental contradictions at the heart of plantation society. Matthias Devo understood he was fighting a war on multiple fronts. His first priority was managing his own household, which was fracturing under the strain. Catherine had stopped speaking to him entirely, taking her meals in her room and refusing to participate in any social functions. Nathaniel and Marcus were openly arguing about how to handle the situation. Nathaniel wanted Jules sold immediately to someone in Texas or Mississippi, removing the problem entirely, while Marcus suggested they could use the trial to destroy Lauron DeSamp's credibility and reputation. Elise, the youngest daughter, had responded to the crisis in an unexpected way. She had started attending church services twice daily, praying with an intensity that bordered on fanaticism. When asked what she was praying for, she would only say, "The truth. I'm praying that the truth comes out, whatever it is." Meanwhile, Jules had been moved from the carpentry shop to a locked storage room in the barn, effectively in prison for his own protection. Abraham brought him food twice a day and reported that Jules spent his time reading. Matthias had allowed him access to books, perhaps out of guilt, perhaps out of some lingering belief that education had value, even for property. Jules read philosophy, history, poetry. He was preparing himself for something, though Abraham couldn't determine what. At Oak Grove Plantation, the situation was even more volatile. Vivian had not left her room since the confrontation at the carpentry shop. Servants reported hearing her crying at night, sometimes talking to herself. Ruran had taken to drinking from morning to evening, his face perpetually flushed, his movements jerky with barely controlled rage. He kept a loaded pistol on his desk, and another in his bedroom, and more than one visitor commented that he seemed to be waiting for an excuse to use them. The broader planter community was divided. Some supported Lauron, seeing the matter as a clear case of Matthias failing to properly control his property and allowing a dangerous situation to develop. Others sided with Matthias, viewing Lauron's public legal action as a violation of the unwritten code that plantation business stayed private. A third group tried to remain neutral, but found themselves forced to take positions as the trial date approached. Parish Court Judge Edmund Thibodeau, who would preside over the hearing, was a 62-year-old veteran of Louisiana politics who had spent 4 decades carefully navigating the treacherous waters of planter society. He understood that this case was going to force him to make rulings that would anger half the parish, regardless of how he decided. His private journal, discovered decades later, revealed his thinking. March 15, 1845. I have before me a case that epitomizes everything wrong with our peculiar institution, while simultaneously demonstrating why we cannot acknowledge those wrongs publicly. Lauron Desson has accused Matthias Dale of gross negligence in managing an enslaved man whose physical appearance has created improper attractions among white women of quality. The accusation is true and everyone knows it. But to rule in Lauron's favor would be to admit that our carefully constructed racial hierarchy can be disrupted by something as simple as beauty, that our white women are not inherently elevated above enslaved men by the natural order we claim governs our society. To rule in Matthias's favor would be to deny Lauron justice for a legitimate grievance and potentially encourage further disorder. There is no good outcome. I pray for wisdom, but I fear what wisdom will demand. As the trial date approached, 3 new developments added layers of complexity to an already impossible situation. The first came from an unexpected source. Dr. Marcus Clayton, who had been present at the disastrous dinner party, approached Matthias with a private proposal. "I've been thinking about the broader implications of this case," Clayton said. They were meeting in Matthias's study away from servants and family. "What we're really dealing with is a question of classification. How do we categorize an enslaved person whose physical characteristics disrupt our standard frameworks? I believe there's a scientific approach to this. What kind of scientific approach? Matthias was exhausted, his face showing every one of his 53 years. Anthropological documentation measurements, daguerreotypes, detailed physical assessments. If we can demonstrate that Jules represents an anomaly, a genetic aberration that falls outside normal categories, then the responsibility for any complications can be attributed to his unusual nature rather than your management. You couldn't have known that purchasing him would create these issues because his condition is so rare as to be unprecedented. Matthias considered this. You want to turn him into a medical curiosity. I want to give you a defense that doesn't require admitting fault. Lord's argument is that you should have known Jules would cause problems. My argument would be that his effect on observers constitutes a previously undocumented phenomenon that no reasonable person could have predicted. It was in its own twisted way brilliant, by framing Jules as a scientific aberration. Matthias could avoid taking blame while simultaneously reinforcing the idea that Jules was fundamentally different, other, and therefore not representative of any broader truths about enslaved people or the society that enslaved them. Do it, Matthias said. Whatever documentation you need, you have my permission. The second development came from Catherine Dew, who broke her silence in the most dramatic way possible. On March 20th, 5 days before the trial, she approached her father with a confession that would completely reshape his understanding of the situation. I need to tell you something, she said. They were in the parlor, early morning light filtering through lace curtains. About Jules, about why I broke my engagement. Matthias felt his stomach drop. Catherine, whatever you're about to say, I'm not in love with him, father. That's not what this is about. I broke my engagement because I realized that if I married Richard Fitton, I would be making the same choice Mother made. I'd be trading my life for social position and financial security, and I'd spend the next 40 years pretending to be happy while dying inside. Joel didn't seduce me. He opened my eyes. I don't understand. I was in the hallway outside the carpentry shop when Vivienne Desamp came to see him. I heard their entire conversation. I heard her offer to throw away everything for him, and I heard him refuse her. Do you know what he said? He said that being trapped by social conventions for a few years isn't the same as being enslaved your entire life. And he was right. But here's what I realized. The same system that enslaves him also enslaves us. Maybe we're in prettier cages, but we're still trapped. Mia sat down heavily. You can't say things like that. Why not? Because it's dangerous? Because it threatens everything we pretend is natural and right. Father, you bought Jules thinking you could control the situation. But you can't, not because he's done anything wrong, but because his mere existence forces people to ask questions they're not supposed to ask, including me. So, what are you saying? You want to abandon your position, your family, your entire future because an enslaved man made you think about philosophy. I'm saying I don't know what I want anymore, and that's terrifying. But it's also the first honest thing I felt in years. Catherine left the room before her father could respond. Matthias sat alone for a long time, feeling the ground shifting beneath everything he built his life upon. His daughter was right, and that was perhaps the most frightening realization of all. The third development came on March 22nd, 3 days before the trial, and it would prove to be the catalyst for everything that followed. A slave named Benjamin from the Broussard plantation arrived at Deer Estate in the middle of the night, bloody and barely conscious. He had been beaten, stabbed twice, and left for dead, but had somehow managed to crawl and stumble the 4 miles to reach the Duval main house. Abraham was called to the slave quarters where Benjamin had been taken. He arrived to find the plantation's doctor, not Dr. Clayton, but a different physician named Arnaud, who handled medical care for enslaved people, working frantically to stop the bleeding. Benjamin was delirious, fading in and out of consciousness, but he kept repeating the same phrase, "They're coming for him. Tell him they're coming." "Who's coming?" Abraham demanded. "Benjamin, who did this to you?" Benjamin's eyes focused briefly. "The group, the ones who meet at Belafonte. They're planning something for tomorrow night, going to end this their own way. Can't let it go to trial. Tell Jules, warn Jules." Then Benjamin lost consciousness. He would die 2 hours later without regaining it. Abraham immediately went to Matthias Diero, waking him in the middle of the night. He repeated everything Benjamin had said, and Matthias's face went pale. "Belfonte. That's Thomas Hartwell's plantation. What group is Benjamin talking about? I don't know, but whatever it is, they're planning to move against Jules before the trial. We need to get him away from here." Matthias made a decision. Get Jules. Put him in the root cellar under the main house. Lock it, Bar it, and don't tell anyone where he is, not even my sons. Then find out everything you can about what Benjamin was talking about. Abraham did as instructed, moving Jules from the barn storage room to the concealed root cellar that had been built decades earlier, ostensibly for storing vegetables, but actually designed as a hiding place during the 1811 slave rebellion panic. Jules didn't resist, didn't ask questions. He simply went where directed, carrying the books Matthias had given him. "Why are you protecting me?" Jules asked Matthias, who had insisted on coming down to the cellar personally. "You could just sell me. Send me away. That would solve everything." Matthias looked at the enslaved man who had brought chaos to his carefully ordered world. "Because Laurent de Sam is trying to destroy me publicly, and I will not give him that satisfaction, because this case is going to set precedents that affect every planter in Louisiana, and those precedents need to favor our interests. And because he trailed off, Jules waited, and because you were right at that dinner party," Matthias finally said. "When you told Vivian that social convention isn't the same as enslavement, you were absolutely right. And that makes me angry, because acknowledging that you're right means acknowledging things I've spent my entire life refusing to see. So I'm going to protect you, not out of kindness, but because the alternative is admitting that everything I've built is founded on lies. At least you're honest about it," Jules said quietly. "Honesty is all I have left." Matthias left the cellar, locked and barred from the outside, and went to prepare for whatever was coming. What came was worse than anyone anticipated. The morning of March 23rd dawned gray and cold, a low fog rolling off the Mississippi River and settling across the plantation like a shroud. Abraham had spent the previous day investigating, carefully asking questions in the quarters, talking to slaves from other plantations during their brief moments of movement between properties. What he discovered confirmed Benjamin's dying warning. There was indeed a group, and their intentions were deadly. The organization called themselves the Committee for Preservation of Natural Order, though that formal name was rarely used. More commonly, they were just the Committee, a secret society of planters and their allies who had formed in response to increasing abolitionist pressure and fears of slave rebellion. They met monthly at Bellefonte Plantation, Thomas Hartwell's estate, in a locked room above his carriage house. Membership included at least 15 prominent men from across the parish, and their purpose was to coordinate responses to any threats against the plantation system, using methods that couldn't be publicly acknowledged. Laurent de Sam had brought the Jules situation to the committee, framing it not just as a personal grievance, but as a fundamental threat to social order. His argument was simple. If an enslaved man could create disruption merely through his appearance, and if that disruption was allowed to continue without decisive action, it would set a precedent that would encourage other challenges to white supremacy. The trial, Laurent argued, was too public, too risky. There were too many variables, too many ways for embarrassing truths to emerge. Better to solve the problem directly, quietly, and permanently. The committee had voted. 12 members supported Laurent's proposal. 3 opposed it, but agreed not to interfere. On the night of March 23rd, the committee would take action. Abraham reported all of this to Matthias, who immediately understood the implications. The committee wasn't planning to attack during daylight or through legal means. They were planning a raid, likely in the middle of the night, designed to look like an accident or a spontaneous outbreak of violence. Jules would disappear. Probably his body would never be found, and any investigation would be quietly discouraged. The trial would be canceled due to the absence of its subject, and life would return to normal. Except Matthias couldn't let that happen. Not because he cared about Jules as a human being. He was still fundamentally incapable of that leap, but because allowing the committee to operate on his property without his permission would mark him as weak, would establish that other planters could override his authority. The principle mattered more than the person. "We need to move him again," Abraham said. "Get him off the property entirely. Send him downriver. Sell him to someone in New Orleans before tonight." No, Matthias was thinking, his mind working through options with the strategic calculation that had built his fortune. If we run, we admit guilt. If we hide, we look cowardly. We need to face this directly. Face 12 armed men who are planning murder. Face them with the law, with witnesses, with publicity, the very thing they're trying to avoid. Matthias sent urgent messages to Judge Thibodeau, to the parish sheriff, to several planters who he knew were not committee members. He described a potential threat to property and civil order, requesting immediate assistance. He didn't mention Jules specifically. He framed it as intelligence about a possible raid on his estate by unknown parties who might be trying to damage his interests before the trial. By afternoon, the Dew plantation had become an armed camp. The sheriff had arrived with 3 deputies. Judge Thibodeau had sent his clerk to observe and document any incidents. Half a dozen neighboring planters who opposed the committee had shown up with their overseers ostensibly to help protect Matthias's property. The message was clear. Any attack on the Devo plantation would be witnessed, documented, and treated as a criminal matter. The committee's plans had been compromised by the very publicity they were trying to avoid, but Laurent Shaw, drinking heavily and consumed by rage and humiliation, made a decision that would transform the confrontation from a covert operation into a public catastrophe. At 8 that evening, he arrived at the DeVoe estate, not with the committee, but alone, carrying his pistol openly, demanding to see Matthias. The two men met in the front parlor with the sheriff and Judge Thibodeau present as witnesses. Lauren was barely coherent, his words slurred, but his fury unmistakable. "You did this," he said to Matthias. "You brought that creature into our community. You knew what he was, what he would do, and you did it anyway. You destroyed my marriage. You made my wife into a laughingstock. You've made all of us look like fools who can't control our own households. Your marriage was destroyed long before Joelle arrived." Matthias said coldly, "Perhaps you should consider whether the problem is your property management or your personal failings." Laurent's hand moved to his pistol. The sheriff immediately stepped forward. "Mr. Dusamp, I'm going to need you to surrender that weapon. This is between me and him. This is a legal matter, and there will be a trial in 2 days. Put the gun down." What happened next occurred so quickly that later accounts would vary wildly. Lauren pulled his pistol. The sheriff drew his own weapon. Lauren turned not toward Matthias or the sheriff, but toward the hallway leading to the back of the house, perhaps believing Jules was hidden somewhere accessible. Matthias shouted something. The sheriff fired. The bullet struck Laurent in the shoulder, spinning him around. He dropped his pistol, clutching the wound, blood spreading across his shirt. He stared at Matthias with an expression of disbelief, then said something that would be quoted in legal documents and private journals for years afterward. "This is what you've chosen. This is what we've all become. This is what happens when we admit that our system can be destroyed by a single beautiful face. We're already dead, all of us. We just don't know it yet." Then he collapsed. Lauren survived the shooting, though he would lose the use of his right arm, but the incident effectively ended the committee's plans for direct action and guaranteed that the trial would proceed exactly as Matthias wanted publicly. Officially, with every element documented and witnessed, Laurent had transformed himself from accuser to attempted murderer, compromising his own case and making Matthias appear as the defender of law and order. But if Matthias thought this meant he had won, he was about to discover that the truth was far more complicated. The trial of Dusamp versus Dio began on March 25, 1845, in the parish courthouse, a brick building with tall windows that let in pale morning light. The courtroom was packed, every seat filled, people standing along the walls, the gallery overflowing with spectators. This wasn't just a legal proceeding. It was theater, scandal, and social upheaval all rolled into one. Judge Thibodeau opened by establishing ground rules. This was technically a civil case. Laurent was suing for damages caused by Matthias's negligent management of property, but everyone understood it was really a trial about power, desire, race, and the fundamental structures that held Southern society together. Laurent, his arm in a sling, presented his case through his attorney, a sharp-faced man named Gideon Cross. The argument was straightforward. Mattis Devo had purchased an enslaved man whose unusual physical characteristics made him unsuitable for normal plantation service. Rather than properly managing the situation, either by keeping Jules completely isolated or selling him to someone in a distant location, Matthias had allowed Joel to interact with free women of quality, resulting in moral corruption and domestic disorder. Laurent's marriage had been damaged, his wife's reputation destroyed, and the broader community had been put at risk of similar contamination. To support this argument, crossed several witnesses. Dr. Dursch, Marcus Clayton, testified about the unprecedented physiological characteristics he had documented, presenting detailed measurements and observations that framed Jules as a biological anomaly. Eugenia Broussard, Charles Broussard's wife, admitted under questioning that she had found herself inappropriately distracted by Jules's presence at the disastrous dinner party. Thomas Harwell spoke about concerns raised at committee meetings regarding potential threats to social order, but the most devastating testimony came from Vivian Day herself. She took the stand, looking decades older than her 28 years, her face pale and drawn, her hands shaking as she placed them on the Bible to swear her oath. Her testimony was quiet, halting, but absolutely damning. "I went to see him because I believed I was in love. I believed that what I felt was real and true and worth sacrificing everything for. I offered to run away with him. I offered to abandon my husband, my family, my entire life, and he refused me. He told me I was confusing temporary infatuation with genuine feeling. He told me that I was romanticizing something that would end in violence and death. He was right, but the fact that I could feel those things, that I could be willing to destroy my life for an enslaved man, means something is fundamentally wrong, either wrong with me or wrong with the system that made this situation possible. The courtroom erupted. Judge Tibito called for order, his gavel striking a bench repeatedly. When silence finally returned, Vivian continued, I don't believe I was under any kind of spell or influence. I believe I was confronted with something that our society has no framework to process. Genuine attraction to someone I'm supposed to view as property. And rather than acknowledging that this reveals problems with how we categorize human beings, we're putting that person on trial for the crime of existing in a way that challenges our assumptions. Cross tried to interrupt, but Vivian wasn't finished. This trial is a farce. We're here because my husband's pride was wounded, and because Mr. Dio's authority was challenged. But the real question nobody wants to ask is this. What does it mean that we have to maintain our racial hierarchy through law, through violence, through constant reinforcement? If white supremacy is natural and inevitable, why does it require so much effort to sustain? Judge Tibito interrupted. Mrs. D. you're here to testify about specific events, not to offer social commentary. The specific events only make sense as social commentary, Your Honor. That's exactly the point. She was excused from the stand. Lauren wouldn't look at her as she walked past him and out of the courtroom. They would divorce within the year, one of the first contested divorces in Louisiana history. Vivian would move to Philadelphia, where she would eventually become involved in abolitionist circles, though she would never speak publicly about the events in Baton Rouge. Matthias's defense was presented by his attorney, Clement Rousseau, who took a different approach. Rather than denying that Joel had caused disruption, Rousseau argued that the real fault lay with those who had failed to control their own responses. Weil had not pursued anyone, had not encouraged attention, had in fact actively discouraged it. If free white women found themselves attracted to an enslaved man, that revealed their personal moral failings, not negligence on the part of his owner. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in that Baton Rouge courtroom intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next. Furthermore, Rousseau argued Lauren's own actions, attempting to murder Matthias, organizing a vigilante group to take illegal action, demonstrated that the real threat to social order came from men who couldn't accept legal processes and proper channels. The shooting, the committee's raid plans, the violence against Benjamin. These were the true crimes, not Jules's passive existence. Then Rousseau called his star witness, Jules himself. The courtroom went absolutely silent as Joie was brought in. He wore simple but clean clothing provided by Matthias. His hands were not bound, and he walked with quiet dignity to the witness stand. This was unprecedented. An enslaved man testifying in a civil case between white men, his words being recorded as evidence, his perspective being treated as relevant to legal proceedings. Judge Tibito had agonized over whether to allow this testimony. Legally, enslaved people could testify in certain limited circumstances, though their testimony was generally given less weight than that of free persons. But this case was extraordinary in every way, and Tibito had decided that excluding Jules's perspective would make the entire proceeding incomplete. Rousseau's questions were careful, designed to establish Joel's character and his lack of agency in the situation, well answered in that educated voice that unsettled everyone who heard it, speaking clearly and without obvious emotion. I did not ask to be purchased by Mr. Darrow. I did not ask for the physical characteristics I was born with. I did not encourage Mrs. Desn's attention, and I explicitly rejected her proposal. I have spent my entire life trying to be invisible, trying to avoid exactly the kind of disruption this trial represents. My existence is not an action. It is simply a fact. If that fact creates problems for free people, I would respectfully suggest that perhaps the problem lies not with me, but with a system that requires my dehumanization to function. Did you ever attempt to seduce or influence Mrs. Dance or any other white woman? No. Did you ever express desire for Mrs. Duchamps or any other white woman? No. Did you ever take any action that could reasonably be interpreted as encouraging inappropriate attention? I worked in the locations I was assigned, performed the tasks I was given, and attempted to avoid notice. If my appearance alone constitutes an action, then I am guilty simply by existing, and there is no defense possible. Cross cross-examined aggressively, trying to trap Jules into admitting some culpability, some evidence of deliberate manipulation. But Jules remained calm, his answers consistent, his logic unassailable. At one point, Cross asked, "Do you understand that your presence in this community has caused tremendous damage?" "I understand that people's responses to my presence have caused damage. I can't control how others choose to react to me." "Are you suggesting that Mrs. Desau's behavior was entirely her own responsibility?" "I'm suggesting that attributing her choices to my influence removes her agency and humanity. She made decisions. So did her husband. So did everyone else involved in this situation. I am the only person here who had no choice about any of it." The testimony lasted 3 hours. By the end, the courtroom was divided between those who were furious at Julie's eloquence and intelligence, which challenged their assumptions about enslaved people's capacity, and those who were quietly uncomfortably moved by the logic of his arguments. Judge Thibodeau called a recess before closing arguments. During that recess, Catherine Deveau approached Matthias in the hallway outside the courtroom. "You have to free him," she said. "That's not possible." "Why not? You heard him. You heard everything he said. How can you listen to that and still claim ownership of him? Because the alternative is admitting that this entire system is wrong, that everything we built is founded on a lie. I can't do that, Catherine. It would destroy me. It's already destroying you. Can't you see that?" Matthias walked away without answering. The closing arguments were anticlimactic after Jules's testimony. Cross argued for damages, punishment, public censure. Rosso argued for dismissal, countersuit, and a finding that Laurent had acted improperly throughout. Judge Thibodeau took extensive notes, his face revealing nothing. The verdict came 3 days later. Judge Thibodeau's written decision was 23 pages long, a carefully calibrated document that satisfied no one completely, but allowed everyone to claim partial victory. The core finding was that Matthias Dieu had not been negligent in his management of Jules. The enslaved man had not acted improperly, and his owner could not reasonably be held responsible for the uncontrolled reactions of third parties. Laurent's case was dismissed. However, Thibodeau also issued a set of recommendations that would become parish policy. Enslaved persons whose unusual characteristics might cause social disruption should be subject to special protocols, including restricted movement, limited interaction with free persons, and enhanced supervision. Property owners were advised to consider whether such individuals should be kept in the community or relocated to areas where their presence would cause less disorder. It was a perfect judicial compromise. Matthias won the case but lost the principle. Laurent lost the case but the system was reinforced, and Jules remained enslaved but was validated as blameless. Everyone was equally unhappy, which meant the decision was probably as fair as possible under the circumstances. The immediate aftermath was swift and brutal. Within 2 weeks, Matthias sold Jules to a cotton broker from Natchez for $900, $300 less than he paid in Charleston. Jules was transported up the Mississippi River, disappearing into the vast machinery of the interstate slave trade. Matthias told himself this was a business decision, that Jules's continued presence would create ongoing complications, but everyone understood it was an act of cowardice. Having defended Jules's right to exist, Matthias couldn't face the cognitive dissonance of continuing to own him. Laurent and Viven's divorce was finalized in November 1845. Laurent never remarried, became increasingly isolated, and drank himself to death by 1851. Viven lived until 1889, working with abolitionist organizations in Philadelphia, and after the Civil War with freedmen's education initiatives in the South. She never spoke publicly about the events of 1845, but her private papers included a letter she never sent addressed to Jules. "You showed me that my gilded cage was still a cage. I'll spend the rest of my life trying to break other cages open, because that's the only way I can honor what you taught me." The Committee for Preservation of Natural Order dissolved within a year, its members scattered by internal conflicts and the public exposure of their activities. Several members faced social censure for their participation in the planned raid, though no criminal charges were ever filed. Catherine Deveau never married. She remained at the family plantation until her father's death in 1859, then moved to New Orleans where she managed the family's business interests with ruthless efficiency. During the Civil War, she quietly funneled money to underground railroad operations, though she maintained public loyalty to the Confederacy. A personal diary discovered in the 1930s included this entry from April 1845. "I've been taught my entire life that enslaved people are inferior, childlike, incapable of higher reasoning. Then I heard one speak with more moral clarity than anyone I've ever known. Everything I believed was a lie. I don't know how to live with that knowledge, but I can't unknow it." As for Jules, His fate after leaving Baton Rouge remains largely unknown. Records show he was sold twice more, once in Natchez in 1846 and again in Memphis in 1847. After that, the trail goes cold. Some historians believe he may have escaped during the chaos of the Mexican-American War, possibly reaching Mexico or one of the northern free states. Others suggest he may have died during one of the cholera epidemics that swept through the Mississippi River Valley in the late 1840s. But there's one more piece to this story discovered in 1923 by a researcher named Helen Castere, who was studying antebellum court records in a storage room of the Louisiana State Archives. She found a folder of documents related to the Desong versus Dero case that had been misfiled and forgotten. Among the standard legal paperwork was a single sheet of paper in Jules's handwriting, apparently something he'd written while locked in the root cellar at the Dero plantation before the trial. It read, "They will decide what happens to me, as they have decided everything about me since I was born. They will argue about who is responsible, who is at fault, who deserves compensation. But they will never ask the one question that matters. By what right do they own me at all? That question is too dangerous because once you ask it honestly, the entire structure collapses. So they will find some compromise that lets everyone save face, and I will be sold or moved or quietly disposed of, and life will continue as it always has. But I want to leave a record that I understood. I knew exactly what was happening and why. And I knew that their system was already dying, even if they couldn't see it yet. Every time someone like Mrs. Duchamp questions the categories they've been taught, every time someone like Miss Catherine starts thinking instead of accepting, the foundation cracks a little more. I won't live to see it fall, but it will fall. Everything built on lies eventually does." The document was dated March 22, 1845, the day before Lauren's shooting, the day Benjamin had arrived with his warning about the committee. Joel had written it, knowing he might not survive the next 24 hours. And he had hidden it in the root cellar where it remained for decades, unread and forgotten. Casters published the document in a 1924 journal article that was largely ignored by mainstream historians, but became influential in later civil rights scholarship. The paper ended up in a footnote in a 1955 book about Louisiana legal history, which is how we know the story today. The Devereux plantation still stands, converted into a museum in the 1960s. Tour guides mention the 1845 scandal in vague terms, a complicated legal case involving enslaved people and social tensions, but they don't go into details. The root cellar is sealed, considered structurally unsafe. The carpentry shop was torn down in 1892. The parish courthouse where the trial occurred burned in 1861, taking most of its records with it. All that remains are scattered documents, private diaries, letters, and one man's written testimony to his own humanity in the face of a system designed to deny it. This mystery shows us how a society that built itself on the dehumanization of others could be threatened by something as simple as recognizing that humanity in an unexpected form. Beauty created everything the antebellum South claimed to believe about natural hierarchies and inherent superiority. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed, or are there deeper truths still buried in those sealed archives?